Los Angeles was drowning in an unforgiving downpour. The streets glistened under the neon lights of the city, and every few seconds, headlights cut through the hazy mist that rose from the wet pavement. The rhythmic sound of rain pelting against windshields and rooftops filled the night air, a soundtrack to the quiet struggles happening all around. Ben Affleck sat behind the wheel of his black SUV, his mind adrift. He had spent the evening at a high-profile charity gala, shaking hands with influential people, posing for pictures, and discussing causes that were meant to make a difference. But as he drove through the quieter streets of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. The flashing cameras, the polite conversations, the lavish setting, it all felt so distant from the real world. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. At a dimly lit crosswalk, a young pregnant woman stood with her arms full of grocery bags. She was struggling, really struggling, to hold on to her things while battling the harsh wind and rain. Her small, tattered umbrella had flipped inside out, leaving her completely exposed to the downpour. Her wet clothes clung to her body, and she was visibly exhausted. Ben's hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel. Something about the sight bothered him. Most people would just drive by. Most people would think, it's not my problem. But something deep inside him told him not to ignore this. Without hesitation, he pulled his car over and stepped out into the rain. The cold rain immediately soaked through his jacket, but Ben didn't care. He jogged toward the woman, his boots splashing through puddles. "Hey, let me help you," he said, reaching for one of her bags. The woman flinched at first, startled. When she looked up and saw who he was, her eyes widened. You're Ben Affleck?" Ben gave her a small smile, but he didn't make a big deal out of it. "Yeah, and you look like you could use a hand." For a moment she hesitated, as if she didn't want to accept help. But then, exhaustion took over, and she nodded, letting him take some of the weight off her shoulders. They stepped under the awning of a nearby closed shop to get out of the worst of the rain. She was shivering. "I'm Amy," she finally said, brushing her wet hair out of her face. "Nice to meet you, Amy. Where are you headed?" She looked down the street. "I live a few blocks away. I was going to take the bus, but I missed the last one. I guess I'll have to walk." Ben frowned. "Not in this weather, you won't. Come on, I'll drive you." Amy hesitated. "I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," Ben assured her. "Really?" After a long pause, she finally nodded. "Okay, thank you." Ben opened the passenger door, and Amy carefully climbed inside. As soon as he started the car, he turned the heater on. She let out a quiet sigh of relief as warmth filled the vehicle. For the first few minutes, she was quiet, watching the raindrops race down the window. "You okay?" Ben asked. She nodded, but then, without meaning to, she let out a soft laugh. "What?" Ben asked, confused. Amy turned to him with a tired but amused expression. "It's just, this is so surreal. I was having one of the worst nights of my life, and then suddenly Ben Affleck is driving me home." Ben chuckled. "Yeah, life's weird like that." Amy let out a deep breath. "I don't want to bore you with my problems." Ben shook his head. "I'm here. Talk if you want to." She hesitated, but then, maybe because she had been carrying the burden alone for so long, she started talking. She told him everything, how she had worked as a waitress at a local diner. But once she became pregnant, standing on her feet for hours became impossible. Her boss was initially supportive, but after a while he cut her shifts. Eventually she lost the job. Her fiancé had promised to stay, but when reality hit, he walked away. "I guess he wasn't ready to be a father," she murmured, her fingers tracing circles on her stomach. Ben's jaw clenched slightly. He had seen so many people run from responsibility, leaving others to pick up the pieces. "How have you been managing?" he asked. Amy sighed. "Barely. I've been using my savings, but they're almost gone. I don't know how I'm going to afford rent next month." Ben was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry you're going through this," he finally said. Amy gave him a small, sad smile. "I'll figure it out. I always do." When they pulled up to her apartment building, Ben turned off the engine and stepped out to help carry her groceries inside. The building was small and a little run down, but it was home. As she unlocked her door, Ben noticed a pile of overdue bills stacked on the small table by the entrance. He said nothing. Amy set the groceries down and turned to him. I really can't thank you enough for this. Ben studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet and took out a thick stack of cash, more than enough to cover rent and expenses for months. Amy's eyes widened. Ben, no, I can't take that. Yes, you can, he said firmly, and you will. Tears welled up in her eyes. I don't even know how to thank you. Ben smiled. Promise me one thing. She nodded, wiping her tears. Anything. Take care of yourself, and when you're in a position to help someone else, pay it forward. Amy let out a shaky breath. I will. Ben gave her a nod, then stepped back toward the door. But before he left, Amy suddenly hugged him. Thank you, she whispered. Ben smiled. Anytime. That night, as Ben drove away, something felt different. He had spent years playing heroes on screen, but tonight, in a quiet corner of Los Angeles, he had been one in real life. And somewhere in that tiny apartment, a pregnant woman sat at her table, staring at the cash with disbelief. She knew that tonight had changed everything, and someday, when she was strong enough, she would do the same for someone else.